Mark Gaydos is the Director of Environmental and Transportation Services. Mark is a proud graduate of the North Dakota State University in 1983 and 98 with a Bachelor of Science degrees in Construction Management and Construction Engineering. Mark is a registered professional engineer in North Dakota with a background in field construction, roadway design, environmental review, right-of-way, and project development. James Rath will present the second portion. James is a graduate of UND with a degree in civil engineering. James worked for a consultant before coming to the North Dakota DOT in 1998. James has been in design division since he started with the North Dakota DOT and is currently a program manager. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Mark, to start it off.
Okay, I think my slide is up and you can hear me, John?
I can hear you and everything's up.
I did it right this time. So hello everyone, and thank you all the presenters today. Those were two very interesting presentations, or three coming out of two from materials and research, and then out of the Fargo area with the diversion. We'll talk a little bit about railroad coordination. And if you think about this, I think many times we can talk about railroads and maybe we cringe a little bit. And that really doesn't need to be the case as we look and we think about things that have occurred over the last few years. The railroads have changed. They've had a large turnover in people. We've had turnover in people. How our methods work and what we did from years ago are different today. So really, as we started this endeavor on railroad coordination, it started a few years ago with the Everyday Counts initiative on Federal Highway. What I'll visit about today is more about what we're doing in project development and how we're trying to move an effort forward on better applying our projects and coordinating with the railroads. So as we look at it, today's presentation is kind of a work in progress, and we'll continue with it on that. So one of the first things, just to have a few points of discussions. I'll have a slide a little bit later, but we're working on some written procedures. And so for the most part, we've relied on a spec book, and we've relied on a few things that we've done in the past. Gradually, as we've developed projects, some of them have been challenged a little bit and caused us to take a look at how we do things. One of those areas, when we do easement agreements with the railroad through Jones, Lang, and LaSalle, and with approval from the railroad. So with that, we're working on written procedures that we're going to have for both grade separation construction, which is going to be led by the Bridge Division. As well, we have some for at-grade crossings, which are primarily going to be led through the Design Division. And then the other parties to that will provide services as required. Additionally, with that, we have looked and inside project development and local government. We are looking to name some primary contacts for projects. We're going to call them our railroad coordination team. And so those will be the go-to people who are going to have the knowledge and experience to move this coordination forward. Presently, we're already having monthly coordination meetings with the railroad, specifically BNSF, that has been led primarily by our planning and asset management division. And we're going to try and tie our project development and improve some of that communication we have on the monthly coordination meeting. One of the things that can become difficult, I don't know if everybody knows, but as we do different pieces of a project, we have several different points of contact, and I made a typo there because I said contracts. We have several different points of contacts. When we work with the bridge engineering, most of that goes through the engineering arm of BNSF. When we work with the right-of-way and some of the other agreements, they go through Jones, Lang, and LaSalle which is the property management part. And so sometimes we have agreements, and those agreements are different, and it's difficult to understand at times. But the reality is they go through, the engineering has different aspects that they have control of and can do work with, as well. The property management is different. So we might see different methods of contracting depending on which one we go through, and really different methods of risk management as we go through those projects. So I'll talk a little bit later. I have some slides on the different types of agreements, but probably back when I first started with the railroad, we had just a few agreements. We had information that was provided in our standard specifications. There was a more formal process for doing the construction and maintenance agreement for the grade separations. And then there was a different process that was changed very much for the longitudinal easements and the right-of-way agreements that we did with the railroad. So over time, those agreements have changed to a degree. There's more requirements to them, and then we've added a few to them. Now, the big part on the next bullet, the liability, indemnification, and insurance requirements. So ideally, what the railroad would like is they'd like to put agreements together, and they'd like us to sign them. And typically in those agreements, the North Dakota Department of Transportation cannot sign them because we don't have the ability to provide the liability insurance that they want in the home hardless and in the indemnification that we do. So as it looks, typically as they come up with new standard agreements, when we look at them as a department, if they're going to be on a state highway project or a state regional project, we need, and we're a signature to that agreement, we need to put them in a format that's acceptable for us to sign. And so that takes a little bit of work. And really that's a big difference, because if you look at sometimes if you're a consultant and you're working on a city project or a county project, they are a different subdivision and they have different signing authority when it comes to liability, indemnification, insurance. So that's a big factor when we're working, because sometimes we may have done agreements that can be signed by a subdivision that can't be signed by a DOT. And, you know, really we don't find that hang up till we try to certify right away. So one of the big points is we are not able to do that with the state agreements. Another point of discussion, just as we move forward, one of the things that we discovered is sometimes we weren't putting the railroad and protective liability insurance on all our projects. It is insurance that's required by the contractor on all projects that take place on railroad right-of-way. So that includes striping projects, that includes overlay projects, seal coat projects, the whole works. And so the method of dealing with it is going to be different on the different types of projects, but we need to deal with that. The other thing that I want you to think about is lead time. And this is a question that we look at. And I said a minimum of 90 to 120 days. As I mentioned, there's a number of agreements, and depending on the complexity of the project, it may be substantially greater than 90 to 120 days, depending on the type of submittals and the reveals that you have to have done with the railroad. So the key thing that we want to emphasize as we look for our railroad coordination is to be able to look at the milestone, and most of our milestone activities identify an end date for that to be accomplished. Well, really what I want you to think about is your milestone, your 90 to 120 days, starts at the day that you do your field review. So you might want to look at your project differently and sit down and say, you know, the railroad right away is typically not more than 100 or 200 feet of a project, and work to complete what you need in that 100 to 200 feet, so that you can do things like start your submittals, start the things that you need to do with the railroad, identify your agreements, get your plats done. We can start appraisals, things of that nature. Now, some of those will start probably after we've completed the environmental document and have the ability to move forward with the right-of-way activities. Some of them you need to be thinking about very early. The last item on the list is coordination of agreements. And what I mean by that is depending on the agreements and what we're doing, if we're looking, for instance, at a project that has a construction and maintenance agreement, which may be for a grade separation type project. When we look at that, that agreement is coordinated with the engineering arm of the railroad, and the right-of-way easement agreements are coordinated through Jones, Lang, and LaSalle. And so the important piece of that information is that as we take those, they can't sign the easement agreement until the construction and maintenance agreement is signed. But you can have that agreement done and ready so that by the time the construction and maintenance agreement goes through, they're going to be signed the same week. You don't want to follow a linear process and get one done and then start the other one. That's the point of it. Let's see. So a little bit with the types of agreements, just as we've worked with them, we have railroad indemnification insurance protection, as well as some flagging. We haven't actually done a flagging reimbursement, but we have flagging covered in a special provision. We've done a new one, done it a couple times. It's developed by Technical Services in conjunction with Bridge and Design Division. And with that, we're modifying some of the requirements, and I'll step through it a little bit later. So know that on any project that we do that's going to have some of these agreements, we do need to do a special provision. The next thing I've said, we got a construction maintenance agreement for grade separations. Bridge is the lead on those. We've got the at-grade crossings. Design is the lead on those. And then we have a right-of-way easement agreement, one with the construction and maintenance agreement and one without. So it really depends on the status of the project and whether we need a new construction and maintenance agreement or we're going to use the existing. Depends on the type of work that occurs. The other types of agreements, these are new. They're the license for communication lines and our fiber optic lines. That's for work that's done by a contractor. Design Division has been the lead on those and has the experience with them. As well, we have the license for pipelines. And that's, again, work done by a contractor, and design will be the lead on those. Now, when you look at it, and I'll show a couple slides a little bit later on, when you think about those two agreements, they may be used in conjunction with an easement agreement and in conjunction with the construction and maintenance agreement. So you might have up to 4, maybe more agreements that you need to execute with the railroad on a project. The last couple ones on there is the temporary occupancy permit. We've been working on getting that for geotechnical work. That would be if we're going to do as we take that, I put design on there. I meant to say materials and research. They've done that. We've gone out on a couple times and had to do some work with that as well. We have the ones with the survey. The difference between the two is the geotechnical work is going to involve work on the railroad right away, and the temporary occupancy permit for survey is doesn't require any work. It's just a surface type of thing. We've been working on those two agreements. The last two on there are the crossing agreements, and those are typically coordinated through the Planning and Asset Management Division. Those are reimbursements agreements for work that's done by the railroad on the crossing pad itself, on the signals and things of that nature. So there's quite a few different agreements that work and operate. I said we were working on some written procedures. This is just a screen patch or screen clip of the first part of the operating procedures for the railroad agreements for the grade separations. They are really focused on the BNSF, which is most of our projects. They will vary potentially by the different type of railroad, but we're really trying to put things in place for a worst case scenario. So again, it's just identifying basically what the agreements are, and then as we go to deliver those agreements, it's really on the last line, it's identifying the roles and responsibilities for completing the agreement. So what things is Bridge Division going to do? What things is Design Division going to do? ETS, local government, all the way through the process as to how we deliver that project. One of the key things that we have in that one, and John gave me this, is the Bible for doing grade separations projects. I put the link out here. It's guidelines. You see it says Union Pacific and BNSF Railway. It's available out there, and where you need detailed information, you probably want to go to that and then work with your railroad coordination people. But it's good reading, very interested. It's only about 800 pages long, right, John? So just to look at this, this is a picture of a grade separation. One of the projects I was involved a while ago, and on the left, that's a north-south picture. It's the Red River Valley and Western Railroad. It looks like a nice, simple project. One of the difficulties is we have existing right-of-way. The bridge and the interstate have been there a long time. So in the past, when we did a project, we just did our work within the railroad right-of-way. Well, nowadays, I said we have a license agreement. So if we want to put any type of utilities, pipelines, storm sewer, something of that, in that railroad right away, or some fiber optics lines or communications inside that railroad right away, we would also have to fill out a license agreement, and basically with that share that information with the railroad and work through the project. So as I look at that, you might say, well, that's kind of ridiculous because we have an agreement anyway. Well, I can tell you, when we permit utilities in our right of way, we do the same thing. So it really something to be aware of. What we wanted to do on this project was install some conduits and put some communication lines in there. We did a couple test projects and things, and we did not have the ability to bid that project in the time frame we were looking at because we didn't have the authority to put those communication lines in there because of the new procedures. Luckily, we had put some in on one side and a couple of the other areas, so we could keep the project moving forward, but we had to do some zigzagging with those lines. Just with at-grade crossings, this is one on Highway 2. It's kind of interesting. They look up there, but when you look at this and we take our crossing, as you look, we probably have minimal shoulders on the right-hand side. We've probably got shoulder where we've expended it mostly on the left-hand side, on the median side. And we take and look at these, and we got the signals, and so all of that work has to be coordinated, because if we have to come in and do some shoulder widening, that's where we might work with having some railroad reimbursement. But the idea is to take a look at this grade crossing at the field review. There's a milestone item in that field review where we look at the signals and all the other information, and it really sets us up to do the later work. This is just a slide for local government. One of the things that we note with that is that if we're going to coordinate and have it on a state regional project, we're going to coordinate that through the bridge division. We do have many local government projects developed by cities and counties, and they're going to develop those respective of the local public agency procedures and abilities. So we need to be cognizant of that. We'll work on that a little bit stronger in the future. It said on the special provisions for the railroad requirements, one of the things that we did in there that we're changing is we're putting in a few items. We got a pay item for railroad flagging, and we're having the contractor bid on that. We're including the railroad protective liability insurance bid item, and we're also doing railroad coordination, which in here I have as an Exhibit C, which is the contractor requirements, which is really the agreement the railroad has with us. One of the things is, as we do the different agreements, sometimes they have different terms, but we have a piece of the agreement with us where we, depending on the agreement, we pass on our liability and hold harmless clauses to the contractor. And then the second part is really a right to enter, or the agreement that occurs between BNSF and the railway company. So it kind of works together like that, and we're just changing that. I don't know that we have to do that on seal coat projects and pavement marking projects yet, but that's what we're working on. Relative to the railroad flagging in our agreement, we are agreeing yet to make the payment to the railroad for the flagging. That may change in the future, but we have a process in there for having the contractor bid his number of days. And so we put procedure in there, what happens when it's less than the day's bid, what happens when it's more than the day's bid, and how do we charge the contractor for those things. Not going to go through every one. We're going to post much of this information out on the website. Lastly, we do a certification that's in accordance to 23 CFR. It's a federal certification. Part of that information is there's no railroads on it. If it's something where we're doing a reimbursement agreement and the work's going to be completed prior to construction, we've got a box for that. And then we got a box where the railroad work is required and arrangements and coordination are made. So that means we've got our construction and maintenance agreements done, and we've got our easement agreements done. It's kind of what it's about. Matt Lindeman bet me this morning that I wouldn't have anything, so he sent me a blank slide. I wanted to share it with everybody because we were questioning whether I'd be done. My last slide is when you look at the railroad, I tried to find some things, but what's their concern? Here we've got a contractor, they've got a broken beam, and it's impeding railroad traffic. The thing that we want to think about with all of these agreements and all the work we do on the railroad is safety's number one. I don't want any of us to be the person that has to explain what we did on our railroad agreements and who's responsible for the cost when something like this happens. We need to be very clear. Thank you, and we can turn it over to James.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk a little bit about the railroad coordination process and tracking. So, when do we coordinate? Is it when you're at a railroad crossing doing work right up to the crossing, or is it when you're within 25 feet, or when is it? Well, it's actually whenever we're performing work on railroad right away, and I think Mark had mentioned that earlier too, we need to determine what coordination is appropriate with the railroad. And then whenever we're doing either the DOT or consultant performing any work on railroad right away, like ground survey or wetlands, or some geotech work. Again, there's some coordination that needs to take place. And as Mark alluded to too, talking about the primary railroad coordination team, and Jason with the grade separations, and Aaron more of the at-grade crossings, and Ray with the right-of-way, and the local government on the state and regional system. So how do we coordinate the type of work to be performed on the railroad right-of-way? So we need to identify, what's the scope of the work that's being performed, and then we need to reach out to the railroad coordination team and communicate, what's the scope of the work of the project in the railroad right-of-way. What's our plan to get that coordination completed, and then provide the documentation to the coordination team, and then provide updates. And that goes both ways, but between the designer and railroad company and the coordination team. And consultants will follow our normal process, going through the tech support person typically. Railroad coordination team will enter the information into the railroad tracking program and then coordinate directly with the railroad company. So the railroad tracking program, this is something that's new. We're just in the process now. We're going to try rolling it out. And what it does is that it references our RIMS program, which contains the basic project information, like your PCN, project number, project description. And it references the information from Federal Rail Administration. And to get into this program, each project, when it sees a railroad milestone activity that's in RIMS, that's a flag for the program. So it pulls it out and puts it into this report. So if you have a project out there and you don't see a railroad activity, let's say that you maybe just have you find out, I'm going to impact some railroad right away, and then there's no railroad activity. We need to coordinate with the railroad. So what we want to do is, reach out to your program manager. We'll get that milestone activity loaded, and then it'll end up in this program here, and then we can coordinate with the railroad, on that right-of-way impact. This is a screen, that's in the program. It's kind of a little cheat sheet of, the types of the work that are being performed on the railroad right-of-way. It's maybe not all inclusive, but it's pretty much most of the work that we would perform on railroad right-of-way. And just as an example, if you have type A, crossings with no work within 25 feet of the center line, you go to number 1 with a dot, and then, so in that case, you would need some railroad insurance. Let's say that you have B, you are within 25 feet, well, there's another dot, number 2, well then flagging is applicable. And let's say you've got letter E, grading or drainage ditch within the existing easement. We also have number 4, and then you're going to need a construction maintenance agreement or roadway. If you're within 25 feet again, then you'd probably need the flagging. So it's important to know what type of work is being performed in the railroad right away, and then when to identify and start the coordination. I think Mark mentioned this. And by the time of the field review, we need to start identifying that work in the railroad right away and start the coordination at that time, open up the communication, and get that process started. This is another screen from the program that the railroad coordination team will be completing. And what it does is we need information from the designers or consultants on the scope of work. And so, it identifies the railroad company, the crossing number, and then the scope of the work that's going to be performed within the railroad right away. This is important to not only to us but to the railroad company. They need to know what work we're doing. Identify the action items, and those action items, again, those are these current agreements here that are listed. Those would be some of your action items. And then there's also a note here for progress notes, project status, and railroad tracking. So that's communication from the designer consultant. It's also communication back from the railroad company, so we know where things are at and when the deliverables will be coming from each direction. And if something is late, we can talk about how we're going to get it back on track. And the other thing to point out is a railroad tracking number. In our monthly meetings with BNSF, for example, they may be talking about something that went to JLL, and well, what's the railroad tracking number? If you don't have that handy, well, that kind of slows down the conversation. But if you've got it handy right in front of you, it should help expedite things and keep things moving along. The other thing this will do is it'll create some reports. I have a snippet up on the top part from a more detailed report and a snippet on the bottom from a more abbreviated report. And basically it's going to report out the information important to both the DOT and to the railroad company. So it has like our PCN, which usually remains constant. It's got our project number, description. It's got the bid ready date, when the report was run, and it tells you if this is ready for bid, which is very important. This also has NDDOT contact, so this is important for the railroad company. The railroad company, who do I talk to? And so it lists that name there. It's also got the list of the name of the designer, or this could be the tech support person and the name of the consulting firm. That pulls that from our RIMS database. It's also got the name of the railroad company, the crossing number, the railroad mile point, which is important to the railroad company, and then also the scope of the work that's being performed on the crossing. And then below it, it's got those action items that we talked about earlier, and then also any status. The abbreviated report is pretty similar. It just doesn't have any description or tracking items. And our goal will be eventually to get this these reports out there. I think at least on the intranet and the local. It does have emails in there. We'd have to decide whether that will go on the internet or not, but for sure we want to get it on the intranet, and then eventually to like what Mark had talked about, all the different agreements and forms, make that available on the internet for everybody as a resource. So that would be a goal in the near future. But that's all I have. So I guess at that, I can open it up to questions.
All right, thanks, James. Thanks, Mark. We have some questions here. One of them is the safety inspection reports for the railroad, for railroad-owned bridges, public information. And I might be in a better position to answer that if you want me to, but it's on a railroad bridge, and the railroad bridge that the railroad owns, they inspect it, but they give out limited public information on those. We have received some of that information, but it's not the full detailed report. They hold that. So there is a report that goes to the public. Another question, how many trains cross the Highline Railroad Bridge in Valley City per day on average? And I don't think that either of the presenters will probably know that answer. I think you can look it up on the FRA website. I know that Jason Thornton has looked it up before and gets how many trains per day on there. So I think you'd either have to do that, or you may call Jim Styron from Planning Division. He may have that information available also. Yeah, I'm looking forward, Mark, to the operating procedures being developed, and I think it's a good stroke of business for the department to develop this and to, the railroad, all the railroads, when we cross them over under at grade, we're on their right of way by easement, and when we do work there, we have to do certain things. And so in order to make sure that our projects aren't delayed and that we're maintaining good relationships with the railroads, and we're making sure everything's safe. We need to outline these who does what. So thank you both for that presentation. That's all the questions we have.
John, there was one more that came in.
Oh, okay. And scroll down. Are the same agreements needed for all railroad companies, or is it different from railroad company to railroad company?
Again, I think I can answer that. They're different from railroad company to railroad company. What we're finding, as you look at the BNSF agreements, sometimes, much as John and James knows, those will trickle into it because you might be working with Red River Valley and Western or another railroad, and they're probably leasing track from BNSF. So that pulls you back into the BNSF agreements. Much as you've seen on the link on the picture I put up, that says Union Pacific and Burlington Northern Railroad. The railroads are starting to combine into like agreements, and so where we've had Sioux Line, they have some different operating procedures that aren't quite the same, but I think the CMAs that John does in bridge divisions are very similar for CP, Sioux Line Rail, as they are for BNSF. Different but similar.
Yes. Good answer, Mark. All right. Another question came in here. Let's see. Can you get BNSF permits or easement locally, or do they come from Dallas only?
The easements occur through Jones, Lang, and LaSalle. We submit information to Jones, Lang, and LaSalle. From there, the easement is signed in Dallas.